Police beat up old woman, but Neymar rushes to save her. The evening city hummed with its usual rhythm. The streets were bathed in the warm glow of streetlights, people hurried home, and cars moved lazily along the avenues. The air carried the scent of fresh bread from a nearby bakery and the rich aroma of coffee from small street cafes. At first glance, everything seemed peaceful, but moments like these often concealed something unexpected. Maria Ivanovna, an elderly woman with kind but weary eyes, carefully stepped along the sidewalk, leaning on her old cane. In her other hand she carried a small bag of groceries, a loaf of bread, a bottle of milk, a few apples. It was all she could afford on her modest pension. Her steps were slow, her shoulders slightly hunched with age, yet there was still a quiet dignity in her posture. She had endured hardships her whole life, had grown accustomed to indifference from others. Life had never been easy, but she never complained. She was almost at the bus stop when the sudden screech of tires behind her made her heart jolt. Before she could turn around, a police car pulled up beside her. The doors swung open and two uniformed men stepped out. One was tall and broad-shouldered, with rough features and a cold, emotionless gaze. The other was younger, thinner, with a smirk tugging at his lips. His eyes gleamed with arrogant amusement. "Hey, old lady," the younger officer called lazily, striding toward her without a care. "What are you doing out here so late?" Maria Ivanovna frowned slightly but remained calm as she replied. "I'm going home, officer. Is there a problem?" The older officer took a step forward, his eyes scanning her with a sharp, assessing look. "We got a report about a pickpocket in this area," he said slowly as if savoring the moment. "And you fit the description." Maria Ivanovna's grip on her cane tightened, her heart beginning to pound faster. "A pickpocket?" Her voice wavered. "You must be mistaken. I just bought some groceries. I have a receipt." "Oh, a receipt," the younger officer drawled mockingly. "How convenient. Hand over the bag," the older one ordered. She hesitated, her fingers clenching around the handles of the bag. "But, we won't ask again, Granny," his tone sharpened. Realizing she had no choice, Maria Ivanovna slowly extended the bag toward them. The officer yanked it from her grasp without care, sending the groceries spilling onto the dirty pavement. The milk bottle crashed, shattering, leaving a pale puddle on the asphalt. "Well, what do we have here?" The younger officer smirked as he peered inside. "Bread, apples. Doesn't look stolen, but who knows?" Maria Ivanovna felt tears sting her eyes, but she held them back. She refused to show weakness. "I didn't steal anything," she whispered. "We'll be the judge of that," the older officer sneered. Then, before she could react, he grabbed her shoulder roughly. Caught off guard, she stumbled, her cane slipping from her grasp and rolling away on the pavement. People on the street slowed down, watching the scene unfold, but no one stepped forward. No one intervened. "Maybe now you'll tell us the truth?" The younger officer smirked, tightening his grip on her wrist. "Please, you're hurting me," her voice cracked. "Oh, it hurts," he chuckled. "We haven't even started yet." And with that, Maria Ivanovna winced as the officer's grip tightened around her frail wrist. Her old bones ached and she could feel her strength slipping away. Her heart pounded in her chest as she tried to steady herself, but the pain was overwhelming. The humiliation stung just as much as the physical agony. She was being treated like a criminal in front of strangers, reduced to nothing but an inconvenience in the eyes of those who held power. She turned her gaze toward the growing crowd of onlookers. Their faces were a mixture of concern, discomfort, and hesitation. Some had their phones out, recording the incident, while others simply looked away, unwilling to get involved. The younger officer let out a scoff. "See that? No one's helping you, old lady. You know why? Because they know you're guilty." Maria Ivanovna shook her head weakly. "I haven't done anything wrong." The older officer sighed dramatically. "You people always say the same thing." Then, with a sudden shove, he pushed her backward. Maria let out a small cry as she stumbled. Her already aching knees gave out, and she collapsed onto the cold pavement. The impact sent shockwaves of pain through her fragile body. A murmur rippled through the crowd. A few people took a step forward, as if considering whether to intervene, but they hesitated. No one wanted to challenge the police. The younger officer smirked. "I think she needs a lesson in respect." He lifted his foot and, with calculated cruelty, stomped down on her cane, snapping it in two. Maria Ivanovna gasped, watching as her only means of support was reduced to splinters beneath his boot. The crowd let out a collective gasp. Some whispered among themselves, others recorded the scene with widened eyes. Tears welled in Maria's eyes as she stared at the broken pieces of her cane. It was old, just like her, but it had been hers. A small piece of her life that had carried her through years of hardship. And now it was gone. "Why?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. "Because you should know your place," the older officer sneered. Before anything else could happen, the sharp screech of tires pierced the air. A sleek black car came to a sudden stop just a few feet away. The door flew open. And out stepped Neymar. The entire atmosphere shifted in an instant. The murmurs of the crowd grew louder. People turned their heads, whispering his name in disbelief. The officers froze. Even they couldn't ignore who had just arrived. Neymar stood tall, his eyes dark and unreadable. He wasn't smiling. There was no usual charm, no playful smirk, just a sharp, piercing glare that locked onto the officers. His presence alone seemed to shift the power dynamic entirely. The officers, who had been so full of arrogance just moments ago, suddenly looked uncertain. "What the hell is going on here?" Neymar's voice was low, but there was no mistaking the anger behind it. The younger officer, Ricci, straightened his shoulders, trying to regain control. "Stay out of this. This doesn't concern you." Neymar ignored him, his gaze fixed on Maria Ivanovna. She was still on the ground, struggling to push herself up with trembling hands. His jaw clenched. He moved immediately, stepping toward her and crouching down. "Are you all right, Signora?" His voice softened as he reached out, offering his hand. Maria Ivanovna blinked up at him, her lips trembling. I don't know." He gently helped her sit up, his hands careful and steady. Then he turned back to the officers, his expression now unreadable. "Did you do this?"
Bruno, the older officer, scoffed. "She was resisting police orders." Neymar let out a breathy chuckle, but there was no humor in it. "Resisting?" He gestured at Maria Ivanovna. "She's an old woman, and you're two fully armed officers. Do you hear how ridiculous you sound?" The younger officer's face twitched with irritation. "Look, I don't care who you are. This is police business." Neymar didn't back down. Instead, he pulled out his phone and started recording. "Say that again," he said, his voice sharp, "so everyone can hear." The officers stiffened. The entire crowd leaned in. The power dynamic had shifted. And now, the real game had begun. The two officers stiffened as Neymar's phone camera focused on them. The street, once filled with murmuring bystanders too afraid to intervene, had now become a stage for justice. Every person present was watching, recording, waiting. The power that Bruno and Ricci had wielded so recklessly moments ago was slipping through their fingers. Bruno licked his lips, shifting uncomfortably. He had handled hundreds of situations like this before, intimidating, controlling, making people feel small. But this was different. This wasn't some nameless old woman they could push around without consequences. This was Neymar, a man recognized worldwide, a man whose name alone carried weight. And now that man was staring them down. The younger officer, Ricci, let out a nervous laugh, trying to regain control. "You think your little video is going to change anything?" he sneered. "This is protocol. She was resisting and She was resisting?" Neymar cut him off, his voice sharp. "She can barely walk. You threw her to the ground. You broke her cane." His gaze darkened. "And now you want to justify it?" Bruno squared his shoulders, attempting to reclaim his authority. "This is none of your business, Neymar." Neymar arched a brow, his voice dangerously calm. "When an innocent woman gets beaten on the street by the people meant to protect her, that makes it everyone's business." The crowd shifted. People who had once stood still were now stepping forward. Their fear was fading. Ricci's eyes darted around. He could feel the tide turning against them. "We're done here," he muttered to Bruno. "Let's go." But Neymar blocked their path. "You don't get to walk away from this," he said, his voice steady but filled with an unmistakable warning. Bruno glared at him. "You're interfering with an investigation." Neymar tilted his head. "Oh really?" He held up his phone. "Then tell me, what crime did she commit?" Bruno hesitated. He had no answer. Neymar took a step closer. The officers instinctively took a step back. "You don't have one, do you?" Neymar's voice was quiet now, but it cut through the air like a knife. "You stopped her because you could. Because you thought no one would stop you. He let his words sink in before delivering the final blow. But I did. The weight of his statement hung between them. And then, sirens. A second police car screeched around the corner, coming to a sudden halt. 2 officers stepped out, followed by a superior officer. His uniform was crisp, his expression unreadable. But the moment he saw Neymar, his entire demeanor shifted. He had seen the videos. He knew exactly what kind of disaster this was turning into. His gaze snapped to Bruno and Ricci. What the hell is going on here? Bruno opened his mouth, but Neymar spoke first. These 2 officers threw an elderly woman to the ground, he said, his voice deadly calm. They accused her of being a pickpocket, despite having no evidence. They broke her cane. He pointed toward the shattered wood still lying on the pavement. And when she was in pain, they laughed. The superior officer's face turned to stone. He looked at Maria Ivanovna, still trembling, Neymar kneeling beside her protectively. And then, finally, he turned back to his men. Bruno. Ricci. His voice was ice. Hand over your badges. The crowd gasped. Ricci's mouth fell open. Wait, what? Bruno clenched his fist. You can't be serious. Now. The officers behind him didn't hesitate. They stepped forward, hands hovering near their belts, ready to act if necessary. Bruno's jaw clenched. He knew there was no way out of this. Not when Neymar was standing right there. With a jerky movement, he pulled off his badge and tossed it onto the hood of the patrol car. Ricci hesitated for a split second before doing the same, though his hands were shaking with rage. The crowd erupted into murmurs. Neymar finally lowered his phone. The superior officer exhaled, then turned back to Maria. Ma'am, we deeply regret what happened tonight. An ambulance is on its way. Maria blinked up at him, her lips quivering. It wasn't supposed to be like this, she whispered. They were supposed to protect people. The officer's jaw tightened. He had no good response to that. Neymar squeezed Maria's hand. It's over now, he said gently. She looked at him, her eyes filled with gratitude. Thank you. He smiled, though it was small and tinged with sadness. You don't have to thank me. As if on cue, the ambulance arrived. Paramedics rushed out, carefully helping Maria onto a stretcher. Neymar walked beside her, his presence steady and reassuring. One of the medics turned to him. Are you a relative? Neymar shook his head. No then, after a moment, but I'm not leaving her alone. The medic hesitated, then nodded. All right, come with us. As Neymar helped Maria into the ambulance, the crowd began to cheer. Not because justice had been served, but because, for once, someone had stood up against the untouchable. The ambulance doors shut behind Neymar, sealing him inside with Maria Ivanovna and the paramedic. The sirens blared again, and the vehicle pulled away from the scene, leaving behind the remnants of a night that had already begun making headlines. Maria lay on the stretcher, her frail hands clutching the blanket draped over her as she looked up at Neymar, still struggling to believe he was real. You don't have to stay, she whispered. Neymar shook his head, leaning forward slightly, his expression warm but resolute. I'm not leaving you alone. She let out a shaky breath. I've been alone for so long. Neymar felt a pang in his chest. He had only just met this woman, but the weight of her words settled deep within him. Well, he said softly, you're not alone tonight. The paramedics worked efficiently, checking her vitals and carefully examining her wrist, which was already swollen. One of them sighed. She's got a bad sprain, but no fracture. We'll still need to get X-rays to be sure. Maria nodded weakly, as if the pain barely mattered. Her mind was elsewhere, still trapped in the moment where her life had been flipped upside down. Her voice was quiet when she spoke again. Do you think they'll get away with it? Neymar's jaw tightened. He knew exactly who she meant. Bruno and Ricci, the 2 officers who had treated her like she was nothing, expecting no consequences. No, he said firmly. Not this time. Maria studied him, her tired eyes filled with something close to wonder. Why did you stop? Neymar exhaled, running a hand through his hair. Because I couldn't just drive past. She let that sit between them for a moment before giving a sad smile. Most people would have. He nodded slowly. Yeah. But that's the problem, isn't it? Maria reached out, her fingers brushing his hand. Maybe tonight changes something. Neymar looked down at her frail hand in his own, then back into her eyes. It will. Outside the ambulance, the world was already reacting. Social media exploded with videos of the incident. Clips of Neymar confronting the officers had already gone viral, shared by millions across different platforms. Hashtags demanding justice for Maria trended worldwide. Neymar saves elderly woman from police brutality. A true hero. Corrupt officers caught on camera. Thanks to Neymar. When will this stop? Public outrage over viral video. People weren't just talking. They were angry. Protests had already begun forming outside the police station. Citizens were demanding real consequences, not just another empty apology. The pressure was mounting. When the ambulance arrived at the hospital, a small crowd had already gathered outside. Reporters, activists, everyday people, all waiting to see what would happen next. The cameras flashed relentlessly as Neymar stepped out, shielding Maria from the chaos. Mr. Neymar, can we get a statement? Do you plan to press charges? What do you want to say to the officers involved? Neymar ignored them all. Right now, the only thing that mattered was Maria. He guided her into the hospital, staying close as doctors took over. They helped her into a wheelchair, carefully wheeling her down the hall while a nurse spoke to Neymar. She'll need rest, but she'll recover. It's just going to take some time. Neymar nodded, glancing down at Maria. Can she stay here as long as she needs? The nurse hesitated. Well, she doesn't have insurance. We'll have to see. I'll pay for everything. Neymar cut her off without hesitation. Whatever she needs. Maria's head snapped up, eyes wide. Oh no, I couldn't. You can, Neymar said gently. And you will. Tears welled up in Maria's eyes. No one has ever done something like this for me before. Neymar crouched beside her chair, looking at her with nothing but kindness. Then it's about time, isn't it? She let out a weak chuckle, brushing away a tear. A familiar voice interrupted the moment. Mr. Neymar. Neymar turned to see a police captain standing nearby, flanked by two other officers. The tension in the air immediately thickened. Maria visibly shrank, her fingers gripping the armrests of her wheelchair. Neymar straightened, stepping protectively between her and the officers. His entire demeanor shifted, no longer soft, no longer warm. His expression was stone. What do you want? His voice was sharp. The captain cleared his throat. I just wanted to personally assure you that the officers involved have been placed on immediate suspension pending a full investigation. Neymar crossed his arms. Suspension isn't enough. The captain hesitated. He had expected gratitude, not defiance. The department is handling this as best we can. No, Neymar cut in, his tone hard. You're handling it because the world saw what happened. If it wasn't for the videos, for the people recording, you'd be sweeping this under the rug like every other time. The captain bristled. That's not. Neymar took a step closer. Make sure they don't get their jobs back. The captain's eyes flickered with something. Uncertainty? Annoyance? Fear? He cleared his throat again. We'll see what the investigation finds. Neymar's gaze didn't waver. You already know what it's going to find. A thick silence settled between them. The captain exhaled, then gave a curt nod before turning to leave. Maria watched the exchange, her hands still trembling slightly. Do you think they'll actually do something? Neymar's jaw clenched. They don't have a choice anymore. As the night stretched on, Maria was settled into a quiet hospital room, the chaos of the outside world feeling like a distant storm. But Neymar wasn't leaving. He stayed by her bedside, refusing to let her feel alone. She turned to him after a while, her voice soft. You remind me of my grandson. Neymar smiled. Yeah. He had the same fire in his eyes when he was younger. Always wanted to protect people. Neymar leaned back in his chair. He sounds like a good man. He was. She sighed. But life doesn't always let you be who you want to be. Neymar's expression darkened slightly. No, it doesn't. A comfortable silence filled the space between them. Then Maria spoke again. You're a good man, Neymar. He looked at her, something unspoken passing between them. I just did what anyone should do. Maria smiled, tired but grateful. That's what makes you different. Outside, the city was still buzzing. News channels played the footage over and over again. Neymar's face was on every screen. The world was watching. And for once, something was going to change. The night had stretched long, and despite the exhaustion seeping into his bones, Neymar stayed by Maria's bedside. The hospital room was dimly lit now, the distant hum of medical machines filling the quiet. Maria had dozed off, her frail chest rising and falling in a steady rhythm, but Neymar could tell that even in sleep, she wasn't entirely at peace. Outside the hospital, the world was still ablaze. News stations continued to air the footage. Clip after clip of the police brutality, Neymar's intervention, the growing protests demanding justice. Social media overflowed with messages of outrage, support, and demands for reform. But Neymar wasn't thinking about any of that right now. He was thinking about Maria. How many Marias had been left behind before her? How many had suffered in silence, without someone to stop and help them? How many others had walked past, choosing not to see? Maria stirred slightly, her eyelids fluttering open. For a moment, she looked disoriented, then her gaze landed on Neymar, still seated beside her. You're still here. Her voice was hoarse but carried a warmth that made him smile. I told you, I'm not leaving you alone. She let out a soft chuckle, shaking her head. You've got a good heart, boy. Neymar smirked. Don't let the tabloids hear that. They like to say otherwise. Maria smiled, but then her expression grew more serious. Do you think anything will actually change? Neymar's gaze darkened. It has to. She exhaled deeply. I don't want this to be another story people forget after a few days. He leaned forward, resting his forearms on his knees. It won't be. Maria searched his face, as if looking for reassurance. Neymar's voice softened. Because I won't let it. A knock at the door interrupted them. A hospital administrator stepped in, followed by a lawyer in a sharp suit. Neymar immediately knew what this was about. Mr. Neymar, the lawyer started, adjusting his tie, the department is looking to issue a formal statement. They'd like to handle this as quietly as possible? Neymar finished for him. The man hesitated. Well, we believe it's in everyone's best interest to. Everyone's best interest? Neymar stood up, his tone now ice-cold. The only person whose best interest matters right now is her. He gestured toward Maria. Are you here to make sure she gets justice? The lawyer opened his mouth, then closed it. Neymar took a step closer. That's what I thought. The administrator cleared her throat, looking uncomfortable. The hospital is also receiving a lot of media attention. We'd like to ensure that everything remains under control. Neymar scoffed. Control? That's what this is about. Maria, still weak but watching the exchange intently, took Neymar's hand. It's okay, she whispered. He looked down at her, his anger simmering, then back at the lawyer and the administrator. I'll make sure she's taken care of, Neymar said firmly. And I'll make sure the world doesn't forget this. The lawyer's lips pressed into a thin line. So, you plan to make a statement? Neymar smirked. Oh, I plan to do a lot more than that. The lawyer shifted uncomfortably. The department wants to meet with you. They're willing to settle. Settle? Neymar's jaw tightened. You think this is about money? The administrator stepped in quickly. Mr. Neymar, perhaps we can discuss this in private. No, he said sharply. Everything that happens next should be public. The lawyer exhaled. Then, what do you want? Neymar turned to Maria. I want them to pay for what they did to her. The lawyer hesitated. The officers have already been suspended. That's not enough. Neymar's voice cut through the room like a blade. Maria squeezed his hand. I don't need revenge, Neymar. His expression softened. This isn't revenge. This is about making sure it doesn't happen again. The lawyer cleared his throat. If we take this further, the department will be forced to conduct an internal review. If there's enough pressure, they may be terminated. Neymar's eyes narrowed. Then let's apply that pressure. The administrator paled. Mr. Neymar, do you understand what you're doing? He met her gaze without hesitation. Yes, I do. Silence. Then the lawyer sighed. Then I suggest you prepare for a fight. Neymar smirked. I've never backed down from one before. The next day, the world woke up to headlines. Neymar declares war on corrupt cops. Superstar footballer takes stand against police brutality. Justice for Maria Ivanovna. Global protests erupt. Footage of the incident was everywhere. Talk shows discussed it. Governments weighed in. The pressure was mounting. And Neymar wasn't stopping. He took to his own platforms, addressing his millions of followers directly. This isn't about me. This is about all the people like Maria who don't have a voice. We need to be better. We need to stand up when we see injustice. I won't stop fighting until real change happens. His post went viral instantly. The police department was in crisis mode. Within 48 hours, the chief of police held a press conference. The officers involved have been terminated from duty, effective immediately. We will be launching a full investigation into misconduct within the force. The public erupted. For once, justice had been served. Back at the hospital, Maria watched the news in stunned silence. Tears streamed down her face. She turned to Neymar, her voice shaking. You did it? Neymar smiled, but there was a quiet intensity in his eyes. We did it. Maria took his hand again, her frail fingers gripping his tightly. I thought I was invisible, she whispered. But you made them see me. Neymar swallowed the lump in his throat. You were never invisible. She smiled through her tears. For the first time in years, she felt seen. Outside the hospital, crowds were chanting her name. Not Neymar's, hers. For the first time, the world wasn't just celebrating the hero. They were celebrating the woman he had saved. Because tonight, the victory wasn't just his. It was hers. And it would never be forgotten.